Well, good afternoon. My name is David Thomas. I'm Executive Director of the Milo Space Science Institute, and it's my real pleasure to introduce research scientist, engineering consultant, author, and speaker, Dr. Leslie Wickman. Dr. Wickman, it's a joy. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I want to welcome you to this moment.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Leslie and I have had a chance to kind of talk a little bit. I've been very impressed with your story, and I know that you shared some of that in your intro, but I wonder if you might lead us off with just a brief background, sort of what brought you here and to this moment.
Happy to do that. I'll try not to repeat myself too much, but if you heard my 3-minute intro, you heard some of this already. I grew up in a Christian home in the Pacific Northwest. Both of my parents were in STEM fields. My dad was an engineer. My mom was a nutritionist. And I grew up with a telescope, and my dad would take us out in the backyard on the clear starry nights. Few and far between though they were in the Pacific Northwest. And we'd look at the moon and the stars and the planets through his telescope. And I just remembered from a very early age being just awestruck by the amazing beauty and wonder and vastness of the universe that we were looking at. And as I mentioned, growing up in a Christian home, it was always with the understanding that God was the source of all of this wonder. And so that was really where my interest in the sciences started. And so I was also very encouraged by my teachers through the years in classes, that I was good in math and science, and so I ought to pursue my education in STEM in some form.
That's awesome. You mentioned some of your influences in getting into STEM. Are there other individuals that you sort of met along the way that may have opened doors and allowed you opportunities that you may not have had otherwise?
Yeah, I had a lot of conversations along the way. I think actually one of the most formative experiences I had was at Bible camp when I was 9 years old. I went to a camp located in Paulsbo, Washington. And during the course of the week that I was there were missionaries that were speaking, and I just felt God calling me in a very tangible way. And I felt he was calling me to the mission field. And I was so struck by it and also so upset by it that I went back to my cabin night after night and just cried myself to sleep because I was so upset. As a 9-year-old kid, I didn't want to leave home and family and travel to a far off land. And I had images of living in a grass hut with a dirt floor and snakes all around. And, but the call was just so, like I say, tangible that I ended up, after a few nights of that, just fully surrendering to God and just saying, okay, Lord, I'll do whatever you want me to do. And that has stuck with me through the years, that, every time I come to a fork in the road, I spend time in prayer, just seeking God's will and God's direction. And it's really been amazing when I look back at my life and the things that I've gotten to experience, the adventures I've had. I can honestly say there is no way that I could have planned them myself. And so my life has been much more exciting and adventurous because of following God's call and God's lead through the opportunities He opened for me. So after high school, I went to college at Willamette University in Salem, Oregon. And I started out taking a lot of math and science, but I think, I actually skipped over an important story. And that was actually my first encounter with an atheist scientist. And that was in junior high school. And he was my biology teacher, and he would go so far as to say, you might as well just leave your faith at the door, because what we're going to be studying here in biology will almost certainly contradict what you've learned at church and Sunday school. And I just remember thinking to myself, how can that be? If God is the source of creation as well as scripture, it just doesn't seem logical that there could be a contradiction between the two. So I look back on that, and it was a difficult time for me as a kid, but at the same time, I'm grateful for it because it really set me on the path of looking at everything I possibly could to try to reconcile science and faith and make sense of the interface between science and faith. So I started telling you about going to college and, taking math and science as I started out, but I think I was still a little bit troubled by this kind of narrative of conflict that, you see over and over again played out with Bill Nye the Science Guy and Ken Ham from Answers in Genesis, where it's just these really ugly debates, people kind of beating each other up. And I just wasn't sure what to do with that when I was in college. And so I ended up majoring in political science and international relations. And I did an internship my senior year at the State Department in Washington, D.C. And it was during the time that I was there that I realized that it would be so useful for me to go back and get a technical degree. So I went straight from my undergrad degree in poli-sci to a master's program in aerospace engineering at Stanford, because isn't that what everybody does? So, talk about doing it the hard way. But anyway, I managed to get through that. And along the way, I just got really interested and re-energized about astronomy and all things related to space, and went to work for Lockheed Martin on the Hubble Space Telescope project, as well as the International Space Station program. Went back and pursued my PhD in human factors and biomechanics, and did research at NASA on spacesuit design. And so those are some doors that God opened. I mean, you start realizing the opportunities that have God's fingerprints on them, the ones that are highly unlikely to just drop in your lap, and the ones that fit really well with your talents and passions. And so I learned to recognize those open door opportunities, those divine opportunities fairly early on. And I was like, it's a heck of a lot easier to follow God through the open doors than to beat my head against the wall and try to make other things happen. So that kind of gives you a little bit of a glimpse into some of the opportunities that I have. And I honestly think it was nothing short of miraculous that I got admitted to an engineering graduate program at Stanford with a poli-sci undergrad. So I think God had his hand in that for sure.
Indeed, yeah. It's fascinating. I've had a few people in my career that have opened doors, and I did not come into my college years with any sort of direction. It was a bit of a meandering path, and I feel so grateful to have had several people who opened doors, and I look back on those as, indeed, as you say, opportunities that were put before me. And without those, I'm quite sure I wouldn't be where I am now. And I almost feel a sense of responsibility to kind of do the same, right? To give back that opportunity every chance we get.
Absolutely. In fact, can you tell us a little bit more about your story?
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up, and I was the first in my family to go to college. I didn't really have any plans to pursue a technical degree. And just there was something inside of me, though, that was sort of moving me forward. There was this sort of this quest, this journey, this searching that I can't quite necessarily articulate at times, but I'm looking back on it now, I knew, and we'll come to this in a moment, it was this desire for purpose, this desire to have a personal mission, and trying to discern what is that, and what is, why am I here? And you mentioned some of these questions in your book. These are some of the more profound questions that we all ask, I suppose, especially thinkers, scientists, and engineers, and those who are really diving deep into sort of the vast nature of creation. But what is my purpose? What's the point of this? And so in that quest, I had some bumps along the way. I had people that said, son, you're not going to make it. Had others that opened doors. Long story short, I ended up doing an internship at Los Alamos National Lab. And so here I am, someone that came from sort of modest means, for sure, and a family that did not necessarily push me in this direction, at one of the premier laboratories in the world. And really it was there that I found this is why I live and breathe. And so
Yeah.
I feel very fortunate to have had those people that assisted me along the way.
So important to have those mentors for sure.
Yeah. You spoke a little bit about this idea of mission, and certainly, I'm very curious about what motivated you to write the book. I mean, I think you said in our prior conversation, you felt like this was part of your mission. You mentioned this earlier.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
you want to talk a little bit about your mission and what led you there?
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of interesting, as I said, when I was 9 years old, I had this calling to what I thought was, a missionary lifestyle. And I'd gone on over the years, several short-term missions trips in building houses in Mexico. I traveled quite a bit with Athletes in Action volleyball to South America and South Africa. I traveled with a music group to Southeast Asia and Northern Ireland. And it was interesting because each time I went on a short-term missions trip, I thought, maybe this is the time when God will, ask me to stay. And it was really interesting because what the message was throughout those missions trips that I was on was, you have a mission field at home. And again, little did I know at 9 years old that mission field was the mission of reconciliation between science and faith. But really, that's what I've come to see it as. And so I do feel like that's my calling in life and my purpose, really. And, we've been talking a bit about purpose and how that's so important to people, especially, as we realize we're created in the image of God and we have that spiritual element that sets us apart from the animals, which really gives us a quest for meaning and purpose. And so it's super important for us to find that, I think. And so moving forward, I guess, to the book, you asked me about the motivation for writing the book. And, all my years teaching at Azusa Pacific in the sciences, I had so many opportunities to talk to the students about the connections between science and faith. And actually part of my role for the first 15 years I was at APU was directing the research, the Center for Research in Science. And in that role, I invited experts from all over the world to talk about how they had reconciled whatever their particular field of science was with their faith. And so it felt like a second PhD because I had the amazing opportunity to sit at the feet of all of these scholars and sages from around the world. And so it was interesting, I guess it was 2014 that there was some big news in the astronomy world. I was teaching astronomy, and big news in the astronomy world about possible evidence for Einstein's predicted gravity waves. And so I was asked by the media people at Azusa Pacific if I would be willing to talk to some different outlets, news outlets, about what this might mean from a Christian perspective. And so that led to an opportunity. I was contacted like late in the day, right before I was going to teach a 3-hour astronomy class that night. And they asked me, would you be willing to write an op-ed article for CNN's website? But they need it by tomorrow morning. So I was teaching until I think it was 8 o'clock that night. And so I was like, well, I've been thinking about this a lot already, so let's see what I can do. So I wrote the article, sent it in. The CNN editor titled it very provocatively. I think he called it, Does Big Bang Breakthrough Offer Proof of God? And both as a scientist as well as a Christian, I am very careful with that word proof, because everybody means something different by it. And I prefer to say, where does the evidence lead us? And so anyway, the editor knew what he was doing, apparently, because with that provocative title, the piece went viral essentially overnight with over 500,000 views in less than a week. And 70,000 plus shares on Facebook, and it was in the top 5 worldwide most shared news stories on social media. So it was just an insane amount of publicity, essentially overnight. And in the wake of that, then I was contacted by a Christian book publisher, and they said, hey, can you write a book on this, elaborating on this a bit more in terms of how science and faith fit together? And can you do it in 4 months? And apparently I work pretty well with deadlines. So I thought, yeah, sure. And so I took a lot of my lectures that I've been using with my students in astronomy over the years and compiled them into book chapters, and there you have it. So again, it was another open door. It was another one of these divine opportunities where, if God opens the door, who am I to say no? And that's kind of, like I said, the way I've tried to live my life.
So there's an interesting comment by Karen in the chat. Many non-scientist Christians have also believe there's a war between faith and science. You mentioned this already, Dr. Wigman, in your comments. And then Crystal has a really interesting question. Have you had any difficulty expressing your identity as both a scientist and a Christian throughout your journey working at secular institutions? And then have you noted any changes in people's attitudes towards Christian scientists or even towards women scientists?
Those are great questions. And for me, the more I learn, the more I study about the connections between science and faith, and really the more I dig into the sciences, I see more compatibility. And it's actually really emboldened my witness. I think growing up and even into college, that was part of why I kind of shied away from the sciences in college, was I didn't really understand all the connections. I hadn't done enough homework yet. And as I've done more homework over the years and seen more and more connections, I've just been able to talk about it with anybody. I mean, whether it's at work or I have one of my favorite stories is I was on a ski trip and I was on the chairlift, and I don't know how this came up, but somebody asked me what I did, I think. And so that started a conversation on science and faith, and had kind of a captive audience there on the chairlift. But I started talking actually about the Anthropic Principle, and, did you know that there's all these universal parameters that have to be finely tuned within a very narrow range of values in order to provide the right conditions for life of any kind in our universe. And it's just, honestly, I think I go back to passages in the Gospels where it talks about, if we're silent, the stones will cry out, and that, God can raise up witnesses from inanimate objects if he needs to. But for me, it's just like all we need to do in the sciences is really kind of illuminate the evidence and say, have you ever thought about this? And it's not a conversation where, I'm trying to push my beliefs on someone, but just kind of say, hey, have you ever thought about it this way? And have you noticed these connections? So like I said, for me, it's really helped my ability to articulate my faith.
Thank you. And so I'll remind our attendees, if you would like to ask questions, please do provide them in the chat, and we will get to them as soon as possible. So maybe we can pivot a little bit and talk a little bit. This is a conversation on faith and space exploration. So I'd like to transition to the space exploration part of this. I wonder if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about just the vast nature of space and our desire to explore. What makes us, I know that the Mars rover Perseverance will land here in just a few days. And I work with, very fortunate to work with one of the principal investigators on that process, on the system. He's the gentleman that is the PI for Mastcam-Z, the vision system. And so we're all looking forward to the landing. What makes us want to go to Mars and beyond? What is it about space that so inspires us?
Right. So, I think we are endowed with this kind of spirit of adventure and exploration and the drive to explore the unknown. And I think, back in the day when we were still, crossing the oceans, there were frontiers that were closer to home, right? And but now that we have fairly well explored at least the land masses of our planet, I think, our eyes turn to the heavens, and it's like, well, can we explore the heavens? And I think it's built into us, this sense of curiosity. And I think God uses the awe and wonder that we experience when we encounter something that is vast and mysterious and not fully known, to encourage us to explore and discover and learn more. I think we see that in kind of all realms of science, certainly. And certainly, when we look at space exploration, Mars is the likely place for us to be visiting. I mean, it's interesting, at one point, I think I was questioning, why are we looking at Mars? Conditions are fairly hostile to life there, given the low atmospheric pressure and the lack of liquid water, and the fact that Mars's gravity is too weak to hold on to molecular H2O. But if you look anywhere else in the solar system anyway, conditions are even more hostile, right? We look towards Venus and we have surface temperatures of 800 to 900 degrees Fahrenheit, and crushing atmospheric pressure of somewhere around 90 times what it is on the Earth. And clouds, and an atmosphere that's heavy with carbon dioxide, but laced with clouds of sulfuric acid. And so, Venus, is known as our sister planet, right? But there's, other than its size and proximity to the sun, and even that is not identical, certainly. That's kind of where the similarities between Earth and Venus end. So Mars is certainly less hostile. And so that's, largely between the fact that it's less hostile than Venus, and it's accessible without too long of a trip. Our attention has focused on exploration of Mars. There's certain obvious problems with Mars being habitable, so we'd have to take our own life support systems with us for any duration of presence on Mars. Actually, that I can segue a bit into a conversation that I had not long ago with some of my friends in the commercial spaceflight world that contacted me a few years ago and asked if I'd be interested in a flyby mission to Mars. And the mission would take a little over 500 days round trip, but it would just be kind of going by and waving without landing and coming back. So don't know that mission in particular will ever come to fruition, but it's exciting to think about, what we learn and what we gain by pushing the envelope of space flight and just exploration in general, and kind of probing the unknown. There's just so many breakthroughs that come in technology and science from doing things we've never done.
Yeah, well said. And so this is a nice segue perhaps into a question that you and I have spoken a little bit about, offered by Karen. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Since we humans were created in God's image, what are your thoughts about possible life on other planets, and how that possibility fits into God's overall creation? It's a great question.
I absolutely love this question. As you can imagine, teaching astronomy and other science classes to undergrads, this question comes up quite a lot. And I absolutely love it. And clearly the scriptures don't speak to this really. One of the things that I love to refer to is John 3:16. And we all know that by heart. For God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten son, that whosoever believeth on him should not perish but have everlasting life. And the word in the Greek for world is cosmos. And I absolutely love that. The original Greek, for God so loved the cosmos that he sent his son. And I just love that. I think that leaves the door wide open to other sentient beings somewhere in the universe. if you look at simply the kind of the odds or the probabilities of life arising in our universe, you know that it's a pretty remote chance from a naturalistic standpoint that life would arise even once in our universe. But it did, and I believe it was because God willed it to be. And therefore, you know, if God wanted life elsewhere in the universe, bring it on. You know, I'm kind of excited about the possibility of that. And, you know, the idea too, you know, we talk, these days we talk about a multiverse, the possibility of a multiverse with a large or maybe even infinite number of additional universes. And certainly my idea of who God is certainly big enough for a multiverse. I believe that he's the Lord over all creation.
Yeah, well said. You were talking about the discovery of gravitational waves, and we've seen a lot of predictions around both gravity and relativity, and now the predictions of things like, you know, string theory and the multiverse. So, can you talk a little bit about how these discoveries, if you want to call them that, or revelations, if you will, uh, actually reinforce your view about the creator as opposed to creating dissonance?
Yeah, I think, you know, a fear-based approach to science and faith, one that's fearful that there may be conflict, would try to possibly put God in a box and limit his capabilities or what he has done. And as I've said before, you know, my view of who God is has been so greatly expanded by studying science and seeing the compatibility, that that fear is gone for me. I don't have any fears about what we might learn through science, contradicting or challenging who God is. And so, yeah, I've talked a little bit about the multiverse already. If you read Hawking's book, The Grand Design, he talks a little bit about the possible unevenness in the cosmic microwave background radiation. You know, possibly, and this is very speculative, but he says, you know, maybe that clumpiness or that unevenness that we observe in the background radiation could be evidence or could be thought to be evidence of colliding with adjacent universes. Of course, it'd be very difficult to get any empirical evidence to, you know, decide that. But another thing that you brought up was string theory. And, you know, one of the things that I enjoy thinking about is the extra dimensions of both time and space that various versions of string theory hypothesize. And, you know, the idea that, you know, that maybe there are unseen dimensions of time as well as space really excites me, because, you know, we tend to think of time as a linear, one-dimensional feature of the universe. But if time is just two-dimensional and is represented by a plane instead of a line, then, you know, for me, that brings up the question, well, that allows God at least then to move in multiple dimensions of time. And if he can move back and forth across that timeline that's, you know, running perpendicular to the one that we typically think of, then that allows for a conception of a God who is omnipresent. And not that God is constrained by space and time, but it gives us a way to conceptualize that in a way that we maybe haven't thought about before. And so I love the fact that even at the, you know, kind of cutting edges of these cosmological theories, we see kind of this sharper focus on who God is and this compatibility between God as the creator and his created order.
Fascinating, fascinating stuff. I'll go back to the chat. So William has mentioned, Leslie, Elon Musk has created two futuristic companies, one that aims to put humans on Mars, SpaceX, and another that will build brain-machine interfaces and improve human cognition so that we can keep up with our computers. Which do you think he has the best chance of attaining?
Wow. Bill, you could probably speak to the second part of that much better than I can. So I don't know if you want to chime in, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I mean, I've got lots of thoughts about putting humans on Mars and the challenges there in terms of, what we often kind of casually throw around as the idea of terraforming. And because of the lack of mass and lack of gravity on Mars. Mars's gravity is only about 3/8 of what the Earth's gravity is. And Earth's gravity is balanced on a knife's edge in terms of its ability to hold on to water vapor at 18 grams per mole, but not large amounts of methane and ammonia at 16 and 17 grams per mole. So at that lower gravitational level, Mars is not able to hold on to H2O in its atmosphere. So the idea of terraforming on Mars would necessitate us, being able to enclose an atmosphere in order to hold on to it. So there's some real challenges there, I think. But I would love to hear what you have to say, Bill, about Elon Musk's idea of the brain-machine interfaces.
Well, you cannot accuse him of shooting small, can you?
That's absolutely true.
I think he has a better chance of putting people on Mars than he does of building devices that are going to improve our brains. I think some good science will come out of it. I actually know a couple of people who are working at the name of his brain machine interface company. I'm blanking on it right now. And they're actually some good, respectable scientists there. But going to Mars is just physics, and biology is so much more complicated than physics, especially the brain. So I think he'll be on Mars before he makes brain machine interfaces that are going to improve our cognition.
I think I'd have to agree with you on that. The thing that, like I say, concerns me is some of the kind of off the cuff talk about terraforming Mars without really, kind of realizing what all that entails. So I love that idea. Go ahead.
We've got loose talk of our own, which is rife in Silicon Valley, hacking the brain, without realizing how complex that is and how easy it would be to go wrong. But I have to say that as far as I know, everything about Musk's company right now are being done within high ethical standards, so that's good.
That is good news.
I don't even know what you've used that word many times, but I don't know what it is. Terraforming.
Terraforming is the idea that some of the sci-fi movies talk about. I think Total Recall might have been one of the ones with Arnold Schwarzenegger. I can't remember how many years ago that was, but they talk about basically trying to re-landscape the surface of a planet to resemble Earth. And the big problem with a planet that has low gravity like Mars is, retaining a life-sustaining atmosphere. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would, now that you've defined it, I would say a higher priority goal is to take care of our own planet so that it resembles
Amen.
The future, right?
Absolutely. And in fact, that's for me, one of the big takeaways in looking at, planetary exploration. And because a lot of people talk about, we'll go to Mars or someplace else when, we've totally destroyed this planet. Well, it ain't as easy as all that. And we have been given a gift with this planet, and we darn well better take care of it. So for me, you're absolutely right. That's one of the biggest takeaways.
So for our last 10 minutes, I wonder if I might shift gears slightly and lead to Karen's comment. But first, Dr. we're going to ask you to talk a little bit about the complementary nature of faith and science that you express in your book, and then we'll get to Karen's question after your introduction.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to say there, but I go back to Francis Bacon and Galileo, who both referred to God's two books and revealing himself through the book of Scripture and the book of nature or creation, or as Biologos and others like to say, the book of God's words and the book of God's works. And that idea being that God reveals himself through both of those books, then, if God is the author of both of those books, then there shouldn't be a conflict or competition or contradiction between them. And it is the job of us as humans exploring that interface to figure out how they fit together. And I think of a lot of students that I've had in class, or even myself when I was growing up in Sunday school, just kind of plopping open the Bible at any particular spot and reading from a 21st century perspective, and in the English language without any real scholarship behind it. And so I tell my students, it's like, a real serious reading of scripture requires some work. It's not just this very simplistic reading that many of us grew up with. And another key point for me in the compatibility of the two books is the idea that, as with many questions in life, explanations can be layered. So I like to think of, science as answering the how questions about nature, and scripture answering the why questions. One of the examples I use with my students is the idea that, what would your response be if someone came to you and asked you the question, why were you born? You could go to the how of it and, talk about an ovum and sperm coming together and the physiological development and whatnot. You could also talk about your parents' desire for a child. And you could talk about it from the perspective of, God wanting you to be born. So I think a lot of explanations in life have multiple layers that address different aspects of questions without conflict. And so that's one of the ways that I look at the compatibility between science and faith.
Very nice. So I'll move into the question in the chat. Do you see an ethical dilemma with, as Christian scientists, building upon discoveries made by atheists and incorporating them into our own research? For example, Stephen Hawking, who was known as an atheist. Do you view that as being hypocritical, or at least being an ethical dilemma in some regards? But many Christians have stated this very thing. I wonder what your thoughts are.
No, I don't see it as being an ethical dilemma. I think that, in pursuit of science, we're exploring God's created order. And I think whether you're a believer or not, the principles that we use for discovery are very similar. I think, I've often said that, we as Christians ought to be maybe better scientists because of the fact that we not only have an ethical framework, but we also know the creator, so to speak. And so if we see a rational God from scripture, then we should expect a rational creation with order and consistency. But I think that the atheist scientists and secular scientists are exploring the same creation, the same questions in many cases that we are as Christians. So it's been said other places in this conference, all truth is God's truth. So regardless of what the source of that truth is, truth can't contradict truth, and ultimate truth belongs to God.
Indeed. I hope I get this attribution right. I believe it was Newton who said that everything that I have contributed comes from standing on the shoulders of giants that came before. And I think he recognized that there's this knowledge that's been accumulated that predated him, and he was able to leverage that and take it a step further. And of course, his contribution was extraordinary. And I'm also fascinated by this concept of, the timing of things and pointing to a creator and a design. So one of the moments in time I'm sort of fascinated with is calculus was quote unquote invented, but it was invented on two separate continents. And so these people were not talking to each other. This predates, modern communication, certainly, but it was, I believe it was the knowledge was there and it was ready to be discovered or ready to be uncovered. and two individuals who happen to be seeking into the mathematics uncovered or discovered calculus simultaneously in two separate continents, which I find fascinating.
Yeah, I think Einstein makes some comment about the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, and another comment that he made that goes kind of hand in hand with that is the most surprising thing or remarkable thing about, no, the most unintelligible thing about the universe is that it is intelligible. And I think, math is one of the ways that we kind of crack the code. And the fact that we as humans are able to comprehend abstract math, and that helps us to understand and discover more about the universe is quite remarkable.
Yeah. And so, still on this topic of the complementary nature of faith and science, there have been those who have sort of gotten themselves in trouble, so to speak. I think of Galileo, and I don't know if you've had a chance to read the book Galileo's Daughter. Wonderful read. I suspect Galileo sort of thought he was going to be in trouble, and so he put his two daughters into a convent. One didn't appreciate it very much, but the other dearly loved his father, and they had this dialogue of letters. And only the letters that she wrote to him survived. And so this book was written based on those. But he was struggling with this idea of faith and science, and he held to his beliefs in the face of extraordinary pressure. And of course, that turned out to be accurate. So there can be conflict at times, I suppose.
Or at least apparent conflict that is based on human error, in terms of interpretation or understanding. We see this happen on the side of science throughout the history of science, where we, take a couple of steps forward and then we have to take a corrective step backward. And, hopefully we're on a trajectory to where we're getting closer and closer to a true picture. But I think, on the side of theology, if we go back far enough, certainly we can see the same sort of thing happening. I've, mentioned that I think, Jesus himself represents a major paradigm shift in terms of the way that we see God. Jesus is the Messiah, and the time that he came certainly wasn't what the Jews of his day were expecting in terms of the Messiah. And so I think I think humility, the idea of humility has come up a number of times during this conference, and how important it is for us as people of faith and people of science to keep an open mind to new things that we'll be learning throughout our lives. And I go back to 1 Corinthians 13:12 that talks about seeing through a glass darkly, and just that humility of knowing that we don't have all the answers, and we don't know everything, and the uncertainty that goes along with that can actually be of benefit in encouraging us to explore and discover more.
Yeah, very nice. So we're nearing the end of our time, I believe. I'm going to mention I guess this is this Psalm 19:1. The heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. I wonder if you could, Leslie, conclude with your encouragement on how we should continue this exploration, continue the curiosity, and continue to unveil ways in which the Creator reveals himself in science or herself.
Yeah, I think it's it's a beautiful verse, and through the ages, so many scientists have used that as a representation of exploring the works of God's hands through the scientific method. And God is not challenged or threatened by our poking and prodding. I mean, that's one of the nice things about the Judeo-Christian worldview, is that we're encouraged to taste and see that the Lord is good, and test everything and hold on to the good. There's a verse in Proverbs that I love that talks about how it's the glory of God to conceal a matter, and the glory of kings to search it out. And that it just paints this beautiful picture of God drawing us into relationship through his creation. And so I encourage you to continue searching, exploring, and learning more about science, and seeing the connections for yourself between science and faith.
Dr. Wickman. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks everyone who's joined. We're grateful for your time as well. We hope this has been inspirational to you, and we look forward to hearing your stories in the days to come. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, David.
Okay.